Hey guys, tonight we're time traveling back to a world where playing with blocks meant dodging a rogue pig's hoof, and nap time was basically hen's lace and carrot snacks if you even made it out with your fingers intact. Imagine trying to babysit in the Middle Ages, where bedtime stories involved dealing with cranky monks or irate knights rather than bedtime monsters. And yes, sometimes the child was actually a screaming, tiny dragon in disguise. Before we dive in, hit like if you've ever survived a chaotic toddler meltdown, and let me know in the comments, what's the wildest thing you'd do just to get some peace? So dim the flickering candlelight, grab a mug of questionable mead, and let's unravel what it was really like to be a medieval babysitter, because it's not exactly storybook perfect. In the quiet corners of a 13th century village, young Alin was entrusted with a task that seemed both simple and profound: caring for the Lord's endlessly restless twins. The morning light spilled through small, stained glass windows, casting dull gold patterns on rough wooden floors as she prepared porridge in a heavy clay bowl, feeling a strange steadiness settle over her. These children, still small and blinking at the world, were already woven into the tangled web of manner expectations and silent duties, their giggles thinly masking the weight of impending days. It was a role she had learned quietly to accept, watching, soothing, listening, to fill the gaps between the rhythms of farm chores and distant church bells. Here, in the slow hum of daily life, her heart knew that even the smallest moments mattered, though they often felt lost in the unspoken shadows of the manor. As the hours dragged on, the twins' soft cries morphed into louder tantrums, testing Alin's patience as she tried to manage their tiny quarrels amid the flickering, smoky candlelight. The promise of calm seemed just beyond reach, shadows growing long through the small windows. Outside, the sounds of cattle and distant villagers moved like a gentle, unseen tide. She felt the heavy weight of expectations, of keeping the children safe, quiet, and obedient, while a quiet unease crept into her mind, whispering of darker days ahead, of plague and shadowing death's slow approach. The irony of her role, struggling to hold innocence in a world so fragile, danced quietly in the back of her mind, softened by the hum of her own quiet breath and the faint, persistent echo of her own uncertainty. Still, she pressed on, a steady presence amid the restless small lives in her care. It was during the late afternoon, as sun dipped lower and the air grew cooler, that she first noticed the subtle irony of her situation. How the children's laughter, in its pure simplicity, could feel both genuinely joyful and painfully fleeting. Their small hands grasped at stray pieces of straw, pressing fingers to flickering candle flames, oblivious to the shadows lengthening outside. Aline chuckled softly, irony softening her tired eyes. In her quiet world of chores, she was both caretaker and witness to life's small absurdities. Outside, silhouettes on the distant horizon hinted at the approaching shadows of illness and death. Yet inside the manor, a different, quieter kind of decay, the fading of innocence, was unfolding. She understood, in her gentle way, that these fleeting moments of peace were both fragile and precious, a reminder of the slow, unnoticeable passing of time. As evening settled in with a gentle, persistent hush, Aline found herself sitting on a bench outside the narrow door, fingers absently tracing patterns on the worn wood. The children slept nearby, their tiny breaths soft and rhythmic on the cool air, while the distant murmur of villagers and the faint clatter of daily chores persisted beyond her senses. In that calm moment, her mind drifted to the endless cycle of care and loss. How, despite the shadow of death that lingered in stories and whispers, life pressed on in quiet resilience. She reflected that her role, mundane and unglamorous as it was, held the fragile thread of continuity, stitched into the fabric of a world both weary and hopeful. The distant bells, echoing softly through the darkening sky, seemed to toll not just for the living, but perhaps also for the inevitable passage of all things, gently reminding her of the slow, quiet passage of human existence. In the stillness of that night, Aline felt the weight of her small, vital role settle into a tranquil acceptance. Her days marked by patience, routine, and quiet reverence for the everyday. The shadows outside lengthened into the night, silent and steady, like the slow pulse of time itself. She knew that the world outside her care was uncertain, filled with unseen threats and subtle fears. Yet, within her simple duties, there was a profound dignity, the act of merely holding space for life's small forms to endure. As she reached for a worn blanket to cover the children's restless forms, her gaze rested on the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of their tiny chests. In that gentle, endless cycle, she understood that perhaps the greatest act of care was simply to be present, silently watchful and quietly hopeful for the days to come. In the quiet hours of the medieval village, Aline settled herself near the cradle, her hands resting lightly on the wood, feeling the slow, curling breath of the twins. Outside, the moon cast a gentle glow, while the shadows of thatched roofs stretched across the cobblestones, silent witnesses to another night's routine. The faint cry of children floated through the air, soft but persistent, a familiar lull that Aline knew was part of her nightly task. Though her eyes grew heavy, she maintained her calm, knowing that the small dramas of bedtime belonged to these old, simple days. In these moments, Life revealed its slow but steady rhythm, trust in routine, felt more than understood, humming softly into the dark. As midnight approached, uneasy whispers began to circulate among the villagers. Tales that had long simmered beneath the surface now surfaced into the cool night air, murmuring about sinister causes for the twins crying, blamed on witches or spirits lurking in the shadows. The gossip found fertile ground in old superstitions, and Alin heard her name accused in hushed tones behind closed shutters. A local midwife, jealous of her reputation, added her own accusations, eyes narrowed and voice flat with suspicion. The night grew thicker with the weight of unspoken fears, transforming what was once a simple nightly vigil into a test of resilience and reputation. The ironies of the situation became clear in the dim glow of her candle, as Alin gently rocked the tired twins, her face calm but bemused. The villagers, quick to judge, seemed more disposed to believe in dark magic than the quiet, mundane truth. Two tired infants simply crying for milk or a change. The midwife's whisperings, cloaked in envy, sounded more like the exaggerated echoes of old tales than real cause. Alin's hand brushed a lock of hair from the baby's forehead, her lips whispering soothing words, her eyes tired but steady. It was funny, she thought, how easily human fears could turn the natural into the supernatural, all under the watchful, unseen faces of prophets long gone. Eventually, the night settled into a slow, unremarkable calm. The crying ceased, replaced once again by the gentle snuffles of the twins, and the village outside resumed its peaceful slumber. Alin, resting her head against the cradle, reflected on the strange passage of the hours, how stories could grow from shadows and remain unchallenged until dawn. The whispers faded into the background, replaced by the familiar sounds of quiet breathing and the soft rustle of blankets. She felt a distant, gentle amusement at the absurdity of it all, how the simplest things, like a child's cry, could stir such mighty fears and petty jealousies. Somewhere in the stillness, life simply endured as it always did. With the first light of dawn, Alin rose quietly, her muscles aching with the slow, deliberate motion of the night. The village would awaken to the usual routines, unaware of the quiet battles fought in shadows and whispers. She thought about how fragile reputation was, held together by small acts of care and calm, and how human beings so often preferred stories to facts. As she prepared fresh bread and laid out clean cloths, her mind drifted softly, reminding herself that these moments, however mundane, tethered everyone to their shared, imperfect humanity. It was, after all, in the mundane and the absurd that life's quiet truth often rested, unspoken but ever present, in the quiet hours of a medieval evening. Aline, tasked with watching over a small group of children, settled into her usual routine beneath the heavy oak beams of the manor's common room. The flickering light of a single candle cast gentle shadows, and the children, curled in simple fabrics, slowly relaxed into their beds with whispered stories of distant lands. It was a time of silent patience, where each small motion, an adjusting blanket, a gently closing eye, felt like a quiet act of trust. The distant sounds of evening chores blended into a calming hum as Aline's gaze drifted over the familiar faces, each one slipping gently into sleep. The weight of human care pressed softly behind her tired eyes, and the world at rest seemed both mundane and meaningful. Suddenly, a faint glow and a faint crackling stirred the calm. A fire had broken out in the manor's wing. Smoke curled upward, diffusing into the cool night air, filling the space with a sense of urgency that seemed oddly detached from the stillness of everyday life. Aline's heart beat quietly in her chest as she quickly assessed the chaos. Flashes of flames licking the dark, the worried shouts of servants, and the inevitable rush of fear that threatened to overwhelm the small group. Yet, amid the sparks and ash, she understood her role was to anchor the children's fragile sense of safety. Carefully, she gathered them close, whispering soothing lullabies old as the stones themselves, trying to keep panic at bay with a calm voice and familiar melodies much older than the fire's flicker. As flames grew brighter, marauding thieves, emboldened by the chaos, slipped silently from the shadows outside and made their move, their steps muffled against the stone floors. Aline, sensing the danger, played her part with a touch of irony. She pretended not to see the prowling figures, offering the children a story that led their minds away from the danger. Perhaps it was the ancient lullabies, with melodies hummed softly and stories of peaceful valleys, that kept the children's fears from bubbling over. Or maybe just her steady, weary voice that seemed to say, "There's nothing to fear." The thieves, or perhaps just opportunists, paused briefly in their dark plans, momentarily bewildered by the sight of small, innocent faces whispering secrets into the night. Irony lingered in the air. Chaos was unfolding just beyond the door, yet everything within remained so humanly mundane, an act of gentle defiance. Gradually, the flames outside began to wane, and the distant shouts of the servants signaled that help was arriving, bringing a brief lull to the turmoil. Aline's shoulders eased just slightly as she kept the children close, their tiny hands clutching her skirts, unknowing of the larger risks, but comforted by her presence. Outside, the fire glowed faintly against the dark sky, casting a soft orange hue that seemed somehow peaceful amidst destruction. The thieves, realizing their luck was ebbing, melted away into the night with only shadows for company. Inside, the air grew still, infused with the subtle smell of burnt wood and damp stone, ordinary and unremarkable, yet tinged with something quietly profound. Human resilience in the face of small disasters. Elin, blinking tiredly, wondered how often life's little fires go unnoticed, quietly smoldering behind everyday walls. In the silence that followed, when the danger had passed and night settled deeply once more, Elin reflected on the strange preserve of everyday human life, its quiet routines, its fragile nightly peace. The faces of the children, blurred with sleep and innocence, seemed yet to conceal deeper stories of fear and courage woven into their small breaths. The fire had been a reminder, trivial yet profound, that chaos and calm often linger side by side, separated only by a thin veneer of routine and what we choose to remember. As dawn approached and the manor settled into a slow, steady awakening, Elin felt the familiar weariness settle again, a tired smile on her face, understanding that each night, with all its absurdities and quiet heroism, was part of this endless human tapestry. Her watch, like so many before it, was both insignificant and vital, held together by simple acts of care and unseen strength. In a quiet village hall, Elin sat among a circle of worried faces, clutching the twins close as the flickering torchlight danced across her weathered hands. It was an ordinary day when the children's cries grew loud enough to draw suspicion, and before she knew it, whispers of sorcery drifted into the crisp evening air. Despite her calm voice, often soothing the restless, the whispers persisted, leaning closer to accusations of magic every time she used a simple cloth to wipe away sweat, or a gentle word to hush their tears. She watched the shadows lengthen across the stone walls, feeling the slow creep of a trial that seemed part absurdity, part tragedy. Yet, in her eyes, the quiet certainty of everyday kindness lingered, untouched by the swirling accusations. The morning arrived with the weight of formal words and the Lord's stern gaze, the room filled with the faint scent of damp wool and old parchment. As the court gathered, narrow-eyed villagers whispered accusations of enchantment. A flickering candle seemed to cast suspicious shadows across the trembling faces of the witnesses. Elin's voice remained steady as she recounted saving the children from a small accidental fire, noting how she had simply thrown a cloth over the flames to keep them from spreading, an ordinary act, observed many times before. Yet the Lord's council seemed unconvinced, their faces shadowed and blurred by the dimmed glow, each suggestive of suspicion or doubt. She felt the tension rise like heat in the stale air, waiting for the verdict that might forever change her quiet life. In an ironic twist, as the trial drew on, the room grew thick with the quiet humor of human folly. How easily fear could turn innocence into blasphemy. Someone snorted at the sight of a burnt cloth, as if witnessing a sign from beyond, and murmurs rippled through the crowd, blending suspicion with an unintended humor. Aline, observing this, kept her posture peaceful, hands resting on her lap, as if amused by the simple absurdity of human suspicion. The faces of the witnesses blurred in and out of focus, their voices rising and falling like distant waves, the ambiguity of truth blending into the moment's quiet confusion. The accused woman, who had only tried to tend small fires, now faced the strange spectacle of her reputation, burning brighter than any flame she had ever handled. After a long morning, when the air finally grew still, Aline rose with unshakable calm, her eyes catching the light as if she saw something beyond the immediate chaos. She explained softly that fire was a natural part of life, sometimes destructive, sometimes necessary, and the only magic was in the simple act of caring. Her words, gentle and deliberate, seemed to settle like dust in the cool room, quieting the suspicion that had hung heavy all day. The council members exchanged slow, weary glances, as if recognizing the futility of their own fear, their faces gradually clearing like mist at dawn. In that pause, the room felt strangely peaceful, an acknowledgement that sometimes what looked like sorcery was merely the ordinary act of human kindness, misunderstood and magnified in quiet moments of crisis. As evening fell quietly outside the village, Aline's fate was gently sealed, not with anger, but with a calm acknowledgement of the human fallibility woven through the day's events. She walked home slowly, her small bundle of children at her side, feeling the slow fade of suspicion like a distant hum. Those days, marked by simple acts and quiet misunderstandings, lingered in memory as a reminder of how fragile trust could be, how easily it was broken, and sometimes slowly rebuilt. The twilight turned the thatched roofs a soft orange, and she pondered the strange, quiet truth that even in fear and suspicion, the human heart clung to its small acts of mercy, answers that often arrived only after long, patient waiting. And somewhere deep inside, she felt a gentle humor about it, all a story of fire and trust, wrapped in the simple, unreadable face of everyday life. In the gentle quiet of early dawn, Aline found herself standing outside the small thatched cottage, the cool air settling on her shoulders as she watched the first light stain the horizon. The twins, bundled in rough wool blankets, lay peacefully in a hay-filled cradle nearby, their tiny hands curling and uncurling with innocent rhythm. It was only weeks ago she had been just another village woman, noticing the weariness in her reflection and the faint tremor in her voice, uncertain if she would survive the relentless demands of caring for the children. Now, as she looked around, she sensed a subtle shift in the way the villagers regarded her, nodding respectfully or offering faint, approving smiles during their morning chores. The weight of her earlier struggle felt distant, like a dull hum beneath the calm morning sounds. Still, she wondered quietly whether her small acts of patience had begun to forge a new tradition in their quiet, tired world. As days unfurled into weeks, the rhythm of daily life grew a bit steadier, though not free of tension. The twins grew more active, their tiny limbs flailing with a stubborn, unpredictable energy that tested her patience and endurance alike. Occasionally, the village's watchful eyes would linger a little longer, scrutinizing her methods, sometimes approvingly, sometimes with a faint, tired suspicion that perhaps they had only just begun to understand the awkward choreography of medieval caregiving. At times, a slight irony emerged in her routines. The old remedies, the lullabies sung in a voice more weary than sweet, and the peculiar customs she devised to soothe their restless minds, all while the prophets' faces remained unseen, shadowed behind flickering candlelight. Her quiet hopes that simplicity would suffice clashed unexpectedly with the complex realities of human imperfection. There was an almost humorous undertone as she realized how often mundane tasks devolved into small theatrical struggles, tinsel-like threads of fraying cloth, the soft clink of wooden cups, and the slow, deliberate motions of rocking or feeding that seemed to stretch moments into eternity. The villagers, ever watchful, began to see her not just as a temporary caretaker, but as a figure who embodied patience, softened by a kind of resigned irony. Aline herself sometimes chuckled quietly at the absurdity, how blending medieval wisdom with genuine compassion could sometimes look like a careful dance around chaos. The prophets, with their faces obscured by shadow or light, seemed to watch from a distance, silent witnesses to her small triumphs and failures. The atmosphere, while thick with history and humility, carried an unspoken acknowledgement that caregiving was less about perfection and more about quietly enduring. In the slow space of late afternoon, with the sun hanging low and casting gentle, amber tones across the thatched roof, Aline found a stillness settling over her. The twins rested side by side, their breathing gentle, and even as a breeze stirred the simple linen curtains, she sat nearby, her hands resting on her lap, eyes softly tracing their small fingers and tiny noses, noting how the simple act of watching them breathe felt like a small, sacred ritual. The village's perception of her had shifted gently like the waning light, less of a burdensome duty, more of a shared human story woven into the fabric of their collective days. The delicate balance had been struck, not through grand gestures, but through quiet persistence and humble acceptance of human limits. The journey, she realized, was quietly nearing its calm conclusion, leaving her with a deeper, almost invisible sense of closure. Now, as she looked out over the peaceful scene, Aline understood that her arduous path had quietly carved out a space for her in the ongoing story of their village. No dramatic closure, just a peaceful acceptance of her role. The customs she helped establish, blending simple compassion with the raw wisdom of her time, had become part of the village's unspoken tradition. The faces of prophets remained obscured, yet their silent, distant approval or disapproval mattered less now. What mattered was the quiet resilience of daily life. She felt a mild amusement at her own journey, marveling at how ordinary it all seemed now, yet how profound. The small victories, the shared patience, the acceptance of imperfection, all woven into the fabric of this slow, unassuming existence. And somewhere deep inside, a soft, sleepy feeling settled, a gentle acknowledgement that, like the dawn, some changes simply unfold in a slow, unhurried way, better appreciated with quiet eyes and a peaceful heart. In the muted glow of a late 13th century morning, Myra sat quietly by the hearth, the flicker of the first sunlight filtering through a small window and casting gentle shadows on the worn wooden table. She had received the Lord's summons earlier that week, a simple message carried by a village boy, asking her to come serve the noble household. The task was clear: nurture the prince, nourish the future of the estate. And yet, beneath her modest smile, a faint weariness settled in her bones. She understood her place in this quiet hierarchy, unseen, essential, yet always on the periphery of finer affairs. The air was warm, but smelled faintly of bread and salted meat, a familiar comfort that anchored her amidst the newness of her duty. In those slow, measured moments, she wondered how her life had gently but irrevocably shifted toward this quiet obligation. As days unfurled with the monotonous rhythm of feeding and tending, Myra felt the undercurrent of tension. How easily her humble skills could be overlooked or undervalued. The household's busy servants moved quietly past her, their faces vaguely amused or indifferent, as she sat with the babe in her lap, her fingers instinctively brushing a stray lock of hair back. The wages offered meager, almost an afterthought, reminded her of her own struggles, a subtle irony blending into the hum of daily chores. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of the noble family's distant, blurred figures, their faces caught in shadow or obscured by light, expressions unreadable, yet somehow judging. The delicate dance of service and humility pressed upon her like a soft but persistent weight, reminding her she was both vital and invisible in this grand, slow-moving world. There was a strange humor in her quiet existence, how her role could be so crucial, and yet so oddly absurd. She sometimes chuckled quietly at the thought of an elaborate court feast, where her humble milk was just a small, unnoticed part of a sprawling banquet. During moments of rare respite, she observed the household's daily rituals, children playing in the yard, a servant kneading dough, the Lord's distant voice calling for a horse, and found a strange comfort in their dull sameness. The blurred faces of prophets or noble ancestors in faded wall hangings seemed almost to mock her, their anonymity echoing her own unremarked service. Yet, beneath this irony, she felt a calm acceptance. Life moved slowly, humbling and relentless, whispering gently that her place was here, quietly anchoring another life in the grand, unending chain of human routine. Years later, Myra often sat in the same modest chamber by the hearth, her hands resting softly on her lap, watching the slow fade of daylight cast a warm, amber glow on the walls. The prince she once tended had grown into a man, distant, yet somehow connected in quiet moments. Her work had become the familiar rhythm of another small life, something ordinary, yet undeniably meaningful. She understood now that her role, modest as it was woven into the fabric of the household, each act of care simple but essential. The faces of the household, once blurred and distant, felt more like old friends, faintly humorous in their weariness, their routines. It was an acceptance born of quiet years, a humble recognition that in the slow, unchanging cycles of life, dignity resided in small, unnoticed acts of tending and patience. In the end, Myra's story was a gentle reminder of the quiet constancy human life often offers, unnoticed, understated, yet deeply woven into the unfolding tapestry of days. She had answered the call to the hearth without grand ceremony, finding peace in the routine, humility in her service. The shadows of prophets and noble faces she once contemplated blurred again in her memory, their faces neither seen nor unseen, merely present in the background of her calm life. Perhaps, she thought softly, that was the true essence of her work, to sustain silently, to serve quietly, and to find quiet dignity in the unassuming moments that made up a lifetime. As she leaned back in her chair, the low hum of the village settling into dusk, sleep gently beckoned, an unspoken acknowledgement of a life marked by simple human grace. In the quiet mornings, Myra moved with deliberate care, her hands measuring the precise timing of the infant's feeds, while the soft light seeped through small windows. The routine was steady, almost meditative, as she gently lifted the child, felt the faint warmth of skin, and guided tiny lips to a nourishing warmth that was both sustaining and symbolic of her station. The air carried the faint scent of herbs she had prepared, a mixture of chamomile and fennel, meant to ease the baby's early discomforts. Though her face was often lined with quiet fatigue, she found a certain peace in these familiar rituals, the tiny life resting securely in her arms. Yet underneath, the sharp awareness of the constant importance of her role lingered quietly, an essential piece in the fragile chain of social order. As midday approached, the demands grew sharper. Cries and fussing punctuated her day, testing her patience and her knowledge of herbal remedies. Myra carefully prepared bitter infusions for colic, her fingers dexterous despite the persistent ache that settled into her shoulders from long hours bent over cribs. The risk of infection hovered heavy and unseen, lingering just beyond the smallest cut or slip of her needle. She watched over the infant during naps and night watches, her ears attuned to every soft sigh or unsettled breath, her body aching from the endless cycle of soothing and vigilance. Irony settled in as she, so crucial to survival, was still regarded more for her service than her skill or humanity. A quiet acknowledgement of the fragile social fabric she woven into each day. Sometimes Myra chuckled softly at her own routines, noticing how her herbal remedies became a kind of small comedy, her attempts at curing colic, her whispered lullabies that sounded more like sighs than songs, her face, often shadowed by a simple linen cloth, betrayed an amused recognition of her own humble expertise, adapted through trial, driven by necessity and quiet hope. Her fingers brushed the baby's fine hair as she waited for the little chest to rise and fall with peaceful breaths, her eyes soft beneath the tired lines. The physical toll persisted, aching back, sore shoulders, fragile hands. And yet she found humor in the mundane moments, the small ironies of care, survival wrapped in everyday patience. Her world was painfully ordinary, yet somehow quietly profound. Now, as the evening subdued the outside world, Myra settled into a calm rhythm of gentle routines, feeding, rocking, wiping tiny tears, her movements slow, deliberate, contemplative. The child's face, blurred by shadow, was a quiet testament to her silent dedication. She reflected softly on the steady resilience needed in her trade, the unspoken trust of families who paid little but expected much. the soft hum of distant voices, and the faint clink of utensils seemed to echo the quiet hum of her own patience. Slowly, she eased into the comforting monotony of her duties, recognizing that her life, though marked by struggle, was stitched into the larger fabric of community and duty. There was a strange comfort in this routine, a gentle reminder of the slow, persistent flow of daily life. In the stillness of night, Myra often found herself pondering the ephemeral nature of her work, the fragile lives she touched, and the unremarkable, yet vital, role she played in the continuum of life. Her face, faintly illuminated by a single candle, appeared peaceful, almost blurred into the shadows of the room. The same quiet endurance carried her through endless nights, a humble guardian of health and hope. She understood now that her stories, so modest and underserved, were woven into the quiet history of many unseen lives. As dawn approached, she felt a delicate sense of fulfillment, knowing she had maintained the unbreakable chain of care in the slow, endless hours of her small world. In this mundane rhythm, she found a profound connection to the silent, enduring human story. In the quiet mornings of the manor, Myra would gently lift the infant from its cradle, her hands warm but steady, feeling the soft, weighty bundle against her chest. The routine was as familiar as the faint hum of the distant fields, and her presence seemed part of the slow, deliberate rhythm of daily life. She knew her role was vital, an unnoticed thread in the fabric of the household, yet one that carried significant responsibility. The air often carried a faint scent of linen and warm milk, and her eyes lingered on the child's peaceful face, unaware of the quiet dignity in her labor. Still, beneath her calm exterior, there was an awareness that such days, seemingly ordinary, were the backbone of her modest existence. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower and cast long shadows through the narrow windows, a sudden chill spread through the halls, an unseen foe in the form of fever. Myra noticed the first signs in the child's flushed cheeks and restless movements, her own skin prickling with a faint, feverish warmth. The steward, ever watchful, questioned her with a glance sharp enough to pierce, suspecting the contagion might threaten not only the child, but the entire household. Myra's hands trembled slightly as she scrubbed her palms on her apron, caught between her duties and the nagging fear of falling ill herself. The invisible peril turned the day's simple routine into a silent, tense standstill, clouded by unspoken suspicion and creeping uncertainty. In moments of quiet reflection, Myra thought of the whispers swirling outside her small world, where rumor and superstition danced in shadowy corners. Rumors of witchcraft found new life in frightened minds, and some whispered that the fever could be a cursed spell rather than an ailment. She chuckled softly to herself. How irony had become her unwelcome companion, worrying about illness, yet also wary of the accusations that might arise from ostensibly innocent acts of care. She wondered if anyone else saw the ordinary in her work, or simply sensed that something was amiss, waiting for a scapegoat to blame. The line between her humble service and the suspicion that hovered around her blurred with each passing hour. As the days wore on, Myra remained steadfast beside the child, her face now calm yet tired, her mind quietly accepting the slow passage of worry. The fever finally broke beneath a lull of cool mornings and tender care, her hands returning to routine touches that had once seemed so mundane. She found a strange comfort in the small, unbroken rhythm of serving, an acceptance that life, with all its risks, moved forward with gentle patience. The steward's watchful eyes softened just slightly, and the whispered rumors seemed to drift away like morning mist. Myra, in her quiet way, had found a modest peace, recognizing that her work, though unseen by many, held its own quiet dignity amid the tired walls. Later, as she sat by the fireside, Myra reflected on those perilous days, not with regret, but with a gentle, almost amused awareness of human fragility. She thought about how life's small chores, feeding, tending, waiting, formed a kind of silent testament to endurance, even when shadows of suspicion or sickness loomed nearby. Her face, softened by time and routine, remained gentle, the light from the hearth flickering softly across her weary features. The whispers of poison and witchcraft seemed distant now, drowned out by the slow, steady heartbeat of ordinary life. In quiet acceptance, she realized that perhaps the greatest courage was simply to carry on unnoticed. In the calm, unremarkable ordinary of each day, in the quiet hours of dawn, Myra gently lifted the prince from his cradle, her hands familiar with the weight and warmth of a sleeping child. The early air drifted through the narrow chamber, carrying the faint scent of herbs she had crushed moments before. It was a routine born from years of patience, barely noticed by others, yet vital in the slow rhythm of daily life. As she adjusted her simple linen veil, the faint murmur of distant footsteps reminded her that her role, though humble, was woven into the fabric of the noble household. The morning was neither hurried nor hurriedly overlooked. It simply unfolded with soft consistency, as if time itself had no urgency in these moments. Myra's eyes, tired yet tender, met a fleeting glance of gratitude from a nursemaid across the room. Unseen, but silently understood. Suddenly, an unspoken tension seeped into the household when news spread that the prince was ill an ordinary fever that might have been dismissed. But this time it lingered, deepening the unease. Myra, standing quietly in the corner, knew that her herbal remedies, oddly specific and understated, had played a crucial part in calming the child's restless breathing. The noble lord, dressed in somber gray, called her forward with a rare seriousness, his voice hushed, but carrying weight as he publicly praised her quick work. The words felt heavy on her shoulders, an unexpected lift into the circle of those known by name rather than by role. Yet beneath her modest smile, she sensed faces turning, a mixture of admiration, envy, and silent judgment among the other servants, all watching her rise unexpectedly in the quiet hierarchy of the household. Ironically, the recognition brought with it a subtle unraveling of silent alliances, jealous glances sharpened behind curtained windows, whispers carried on the edges of the hallways like faint breezes. A rival nurse, less discreet, offered Myra a much wealthier position elsewhere, promising comfort and ease that seemed tempting in a landscape of small daily hardships. Myra paused, feeling the weight of the choice pressing softly but insistently, her loyalty to her mistress, or the siren call of a better life. She was aware that such offers were as common as the cracked clay floors beneath her feet, easily dismissed or deeply considered. In this moment, with no one speaking aloud, her heart balanced precariously between the quiet certainty of her current place and the shimmering promise held by another. The slow ticks of a distant clock punctuated her silent deliberation. Eventually, Myra chose to remain where she was, finding comfort in the ebb and flow of her familiar routines, even with the shadows of envy lurking nearby. The household seemed to settle back into its quiet rhythm as the simple acts of caring, feeding, rocking, whispering became a gentle reaffirmation of her purpose. Her hand lingered on the smooth wood of a cradle, feeling the faint pulse of life within. Her tired eyes closed briefly to the soft sounds around her, the distant chime of a bell, the rustling of drapes, a child's contented sigh. Life continued in this gentle pace, neither hurried nor delayed, embodying a quiet dignity that persisted despite the shifting tides of status and favor. Myra's mind, like still water, remained calm and observant, quietly reflecting on the fragile nature of human standing. In the end, Myra understood that her worth was rooted not in titles or wealth, but in these small, unwavering gestures of care that linked her to a world beyond recognition, one of shared patience and human imperfection. The prince's health had been restored, leaving only faint scars on the memories of those involved, and Myra's modest influence lingered quietly in the background. She continued her days with little change in her humble routines. Take it or leave it, aware that the shifting edges of favor could just as easily recede as approach. There was a gentle humor in the way human concerns fluttered like fragile cloth in a breeze, so fleeting, so persistent in their quiet absurdity. As evening settled softly over the household and shadows lengthened, Myra sat briefly by the hearth, the faint glow of fire reflecting the calm resilience that shadowed her humble existence, unnoticed by most, but steady in its own humble way. In the quiet corners of a medieval household, Myra began her days with a gentle routine filled with the soft sounds of her breath and the faint rustle of linen. Her duties were simple yet continuous, as she attended to the babe with patient hands, offering nourishment amid the slow passage of hours. The stone walls around her held only the faint scent of milk and damp cloth, creating a landscape of mundane devotion. It was a life marked by small, unremarkable acts that over time wove into the fabric of household stability. As the days stretched into weeks, her presence became an unnoticed but vital part of the household's quiet rhythm. Yet beneath this calm surface, tension lingered, an awareness of the tenuous social place Myra occupied. Her work, essential but overlooked, carried only the faintest recognition from the household's other servants, and even less from the upper ranks. Occasional glances from the noble family hinted at a hierarchy that pressed down softly, almost imperceptibly, on her daily labors. There was an irony in her invisibility. She nourished the prince's future while herself remaining largely unseen, her worth measured in quiet moments rather than words. The risks were personal, little injuries from handling fragile, squirming babies, and the quiet toll of endless patience. Yet she endured, knowing her role was to be steadfast, unassuming, a silent keeper of life. Years later, the calm irony persisted as the prince ascended to the throne, his memory tinged with faint images of the woman who had once offered him milk in the soft dawn light. Without grand ceremony, his gratitude found her in a modest gesture land, a small title, and a quiet acknowledgement that carried more weight than many speeches. Myra received it with a modest nod, her face remaining calm, touched only by a trace of quiet pride. The irony of such a modest reward for a lifetime of sacrifice was not lost on her. Her influence had been subtle but real. In the muted tones of power, she had carved out her place, not through grandeur, but through the enduring dignity of silent service. As she sat quietly reflecting in her modest chamber, Myra's thoughts drifted to the small sacrifices, lost mornings, unspoken worries, the constant care that shaped the prince's life. Her hands, now old and gentle, rested on her lap, feeling the slow beat of years gone by, as if the world had continued undisturbed in its slow, endless turning. The simple act of remembering carried a gentle weight, an acknowledgement of her role amid the shifting tides of history that often forgot such silent laborers. There was a quiet humor, too, in her reflection, that in the grand scheme of things, her story was perhaps just one of many unnoticed threads spun into the fabric of the epic. Still, she held a softened faith in the continuity of her small, vital part in it all. In the stillness of her modest life, Myra found a sense of peace, a recognition that her humble service had quietly shaped a future ruler, and in doing so, secured her a lingering place in the household's history. Her legacy was not marked by great deeds or loud achievements, but rather by the steady, unseen labor that supported the slow advance of life and power. As the household settled into its routines once more, she understood that her quiet contribution, like the candle's gentle glow, endured through the soft, fading light of ordinary days. And so, in the calm of simple days and shared silences, she remained mindful of her place, respectful of her sacrifices, amused by her unnoticed influence, and ultimately at peace with the slow, unremarkable, yet enduring flow of human history. In the quiet corners of the palace, newborn princes and princesses arrived into a world that felt both fragile and endlessly repetitive. Lady Mirabelle, with her composed movements and gentle voice, carefully placed the tiny children into soft blankets, her eyes flickering with a mixture of routine and quiet hope. Nearby, Master Rowan studied old texts on manners and governance, his pen scarcely making a sound as he jotted notes in a worn leather book. The air was thick with the scent of fresh hay, warm wool, and the faint hum of lullabies that drifted softly through gilded corridors, promising that life would follow familiar patterns, even amid the silence of early infancy. As the months passed, the palace grew tense with the unspoken expectations, and Lady Mirabelle's careful routines became more rigid. The princes learned to sit straight and hold a goblet properly. The princesses were gently advised on embroidery and courtly manners. Yet, between the deliberate lessons and measured walks in the garden, a subtle irony emerged. Beneath the veneer of discipline, the children's expressions often lingered somewhere between curiosity and boredom. Master Rowan's teachings, delivered with a measured monotony, seemed to remind everyone that knowledge was a slow-building fortress, silent, patient, and often ignored in the fleeting moments of simple play. There was a quiet humor woven into these early years. How often Lady Mirabelle found herself correcting a tiny finger's mistake, or adjusting a child's cap, just as they looked elsewhere distracted, or bored. Master Rowan's lessons, delivered with a slightly dry tone, often went unnoticed by the little ones, who would rather watch a butterfly or simply stare at the flickering shadows on the wall. The faces of the prophets, hidden behind veiled light or shadow, seemed to watch these mundane acts with amused indifference, their unseen presence reminding everyone that even destiny's most sacred figures could be equally tired of endless lessons and idle waiting. Time finally eased into moments of calm. The children grew accustomed to their surroundings, and the steady rhythm of palace life settled into a gentle background hum. Lady Mirabel's soft hands still adjusted blankets, her voice now a soothing murmur rather than a command, while Master Rowan's voice took on a more reflective tone, as if pondering the slow accumulation of wisdom in the quiet corners of the mind. The palace, once bustling with anxious anticipation, now felt like a quieter, more predictable place, where the fleeting chaos of childhood was gently folded into the slow fabric of royal duty, with its fleeting joys and quiet, inevitable turns toward the future. Looking back, one might see these early years as a long, slow dance of human imperfection, a forging of bonds amid daily routines and understated lessons. The children, shaped by routines both gentle and stern, slowly learned that their roles would not be carved in grand gestures, but in small, persistent acts of patience and observation. Lady Mirabel's care and Master Rowan's words formed a humble, unspoken tradition, an enduring reminder that even in the most ornate of courts, the true task was merely to wait, softly and patiently, for life to unfold in its slow, approximately human way. In the dim quiet of early mornings, the noble children sat at low wooden tables, shadows flickering from candles, their cheeks still warm from sleep. Lady Mirabel moved gracefully among them, her hands smoothing their embroidered shirts and adjusting tiny collars, whispering gentle lessons on pleasantries and courtly customs. The world outside was silent, save for the faint rustle of pages and the soft tapping of fingers on the wooden surfaces. An ordinary scene filled with quiet intention, if not a hint of fatigue in her eyes. The children watched her with wide, unknowing eyes, eager for approval, unaware of the complexities they would one day need to grasp. Here, in this calm, routine moment, the silent patience of learning seemed endless, yet almost tentative, as if waiting for something to disturb the peace. As the days lengthened, the mood shifted, less a nursery of innocence, more an arena of conflicting demands. Lady Mirabel's lessons on manners and diplomacy became more pointed, emphasizing restraint beneath the fine cloth and delicate words. Meanwhile, Master Rowan's voice drifted through the stone halls, teaching Latin declensions and the chivalric code, his tone somber yet dry, like a pebble in cold water. The young ears strained to grasp both the subtlety of diplomacy and the harsh discipline of swordplay, often blending into a muddled echo of iron and ink. The irony lingered quietly. These children learned that strength required both a firm hand and a gentle smile, though their small hands still fidgeted with toys or parchment, uncertain which to hold tighter. A subtle tension welled between the lessons of peace and the necessity of conflict, mirroring a world forever balancing those twin aims. Amidst the slow progress, a faint humor emerged, an almost imperceptible smile at the sight of a child trying to brandish a wooden sword while reciting Latin verbs. The earnest faces, smudged with dirt and worry, seemed absurd in their seriousness, bearing the weight of their small kingdoms and unseen futures. Lady Mirabel's careful instructions on comportment occasionally clashed with overheard bursts of laughter as youngsters tried and failed to master both manners and martial arts. Master Rowan's stern correction contrasted with the dreamy, distracted expressions of the children as they imagined battles or debates stuck somewhere between training and daydreams. The scene was quietly comic. Beneath their noble veneer, they were simply children, each imperfectly striving for dignity in a world that demanded too much at once. A gentle humor softened the edges of their earnest pursuits. In the tranquil hours after lessons, the children sat quietly in the courtyard, their small bodies leaning against stone walls, watching the birds or small animals scurry past. The teachers' voices receded into the background, replaced by the faint sounds of wind and distant footsteps, creating a tranquil stillness. Lady Mirabel's hands rested on her lap, her expression serene and slightly weary as she observed the delicate transition from childhood to a veneer of regal composure. Master Rowan's lessons seemed to drift away, replaced by a quiet sense of acceptance. Learning was slow, often imperceptible, but undeniably present, like sunlight filtering through high windows. The children, wrapped in linen and wool, seemed smaller somehow, both resilient and fragile in their silent, everyday growth. The simple act of waiting and watching woven a layer of calm over a world of complex instruction, as if patience itself was a modest act of rebellion. Later, as dusk blurred the edges of the stone walls, the children wandered homeward through corridors heavy with shadows. Their small footsteps echoed, subdued and measured, as they carried fragments of their lessons, some learned, some forgotten, all woven into the quiet fabric of routine. Lady Mirabel's tired smile greeted a child's stumble, her gentle correction a faint reminder of the burden and tenderness woven into her role. Master Rowan's lessons, long since absorbed into the silent fabric of their minds, remained unchanged, like faint inscriptions on weathered stone. In these moments, the world felt both eternal and fleeting, a slow drift of human effort amid the unspoken acknowledgement that growing up was, perhaps, always a quiet, imperfect act. The uncertain light behind the windows held little promise of clarity, but much of quiet persistence in human endeavor. In the quiet chamber of the noble nursery, the young heir's soft breath mingled with the faint rustling of embroidered fabrics. Lady Mirabelle, the seasoned nanny, watched over the children with slow, steady eyes, her hands gently adjusting a blanket or smoothing a curl. Outside, the distant murmur of political discourse filtered through stone walls, reminding her that even in these peaceful hours, the fragile threads of power and influence tugged silently at the young lives she guarded. It was a time when innocence was a brief shield amid a world of whispered ambitions, eased by the predictable rhythm of daily routine. Still, she knew the peace in these moments was delicate, subject to the faintest ripple of intrigue, innocent as it seemed. One late afternoon, under the dim glow of twilight, Lady Mirabelle observed an unusual tension in the air, a subtle shift in the children's quiet play as echoing footsteps approached. Rumors had circulated through the corridors about noble rivals vying for control and influence, their whispers laced with subtle threats. Even here, in the sanctuary of childhood, she listened carefully, trying to distinguish the faint, deliberate voices that seemed to drift beyond her hearing, like shadows dancing just outside the light. Her instinct told her that danger lurked even in innocence, that unseen hands sought to manipulate the future rulers from behind curtains. For a moment, the peaceful veneer cracked, revealing a silent, simmering tension beneath the surface. Irony settled softly over these delicate negotiations. As Lady Mirabelle's cautious vigilance grew, a foreign scholar arrived unexpectedly at the court, offering knowledge wrapped in allure and forbidden promises. Master Rowan, the young tutor, faced an internal conflict when he recognized the scholar's strange, ancient texts, works that could alter more than a child's education. The scholar's eyes, hidden behind a shadowed veil of light, pleaded silently for trust, promising secrets that could bolster a ruler or unravel the very fabric of governance. It was a subtle test of loyalty, where the line between curiosity and obedience blurred beneath the weight of human folly. In this quiet, slow game of trust, secrets hovered like fragile leaves waiting to fall. Gradually, the tension eased, and the nursery found its quiet again, with Lady Mirabelle softly reaffirming her watchfulness, and Master Rowan choosing prudence over temptation. The foreign scholar's whispers receded into the background, leaving behind only the faint scent of old parchment and the semblance of innocence upheld. The children, unaware of the deep currents beneath their small world, played with simple wooden toys, their laughter like a lullaby in the slow twilight. The corridors, once resonant with secretive exchanges, settled into a peaceful hum, reminding everyone that even in times of danger, calm could often be restored through patience and quiet watchfulness. It was a gentle reminder that human schemes, like seasons, often pass with time and patience. Looking back, Lady Mirabelle reflected on those days with a quiet, worldly wisdom. How fleeting moments of innocence are, yet how resilient they can be amid the slow, unending flow of history. The nursery's soft routines, the careful lessons of loyalty and discretion, all accumulated into a mosaic of fragile human effort, small, imperfect, and profoundly human. The faces of prophets and rulers, she often thought, remain unseen, concealed by fleeting shadows or distant light, their true faces hidden behind the masks of history we glimpse only dimly. In the end, the true task was simply to tend to these delicate lives with patience and humor, knowing that even in the slowest stories, something quietly meaningful endured under the surface of everyday life. On a cool, late afternoon, the grand courtyard was filled with the quiet rustling of banners and the faint clatter of horseshoes. The young prince, dressed in stiff silks and a small, heavy crown, stood stiffly at the start of the tournament field, eyes fixed on the drifting clouds above. His nurse, a plump woman with calm eyes, watched from a shaded corner, her hands resting lightly on her apron as the herald announced the beginning of the day's contest. Nearby, courtiers and gentlefolk whispered among themselves, eager yet detached, as the first jousts commenced. Somewhere behind the scenes, a tutor brushed a speck of dirt from his sleeve, preparing for the next mock danger. For now, it was a grand spectacle of age-old tradition, a quiet affirmation of the boy's future role, a ritual of passing time as much as a test of strength. As the day wore on, the prince's turn came, and he clumsily swung his wooden lance at a padded target, wobbling under the weight of his awkward effort. Meanwhile, the princess, seated in a small, carved wooden chair at the council table, attempted to speak passionately about alliances and treaties. Her small voice wavered, but persisted, drawing distracted glances from the courtiers. The tension grew subtly. The prince's lack of prowess and the princess's earnest diplomacy were so perfectly mundane that no one particularly minded. Yet everyone was aware of the unspoken expectations resting quietly upon their shoulders. The nanny kept a steady gaze on her charge, a soft nod acknowledging his tentative bravery, while the tutor gently set aside a scroll, quietly observing as the social dance unfolded. It was a day wrapped in slow motion, filled with familiar sounds and tired sights that hinted at the endless preparations for future grandeur. Just as the princess's voice gained a little more life, a sudden interruption arose, a goblet tippling over, spilling crimson wine onto a rolled parchment, drawing gasps and wide eyes. The court's calm facade fractured briefly, revealing a flicker of chaos beneath the old, sun-warmed stones. The nanny, quick with a cloth, and the tutor, face shadowed by a passing torch beam, exchanged looks of mild irony. This was the true test, after all, hidden behind their careful lessons in decorum and diplomacy. The princess, perhaps sensing the moment's absurdity, refused to flinch, her brow tightening in a silent vow to press on despite the disorder. The prince, meanwhile, stared at the mess, uncertain if his next move was to laugh or to look away. In that quiet, unremarkable crisis, humble learning was quietly rehearsed, seasoned with the gentle humor of human imperfection. As the tension settled and the spilled wine was wiped clean, the day drew towards its gentle close, the sky turning a soft, dusky orange. The prince, having accidentally knocked over his lance during a clumsy practice, looked down at his trembling hands, a faint smile touching his face in quiet resignation. The princess, having successfully persuaded a small group of courtiers, smiled with modest pride, her diplomatic effort a reminder of the slow mastery she was gently learning. The nanny and tutor, now relaxed in their silent observance, whispered softly to each other about the importance of patience, their voices blending softly with the distant sounds of children, toddling home and evening birds settling into their nests. It was a moment of calm, a pause amidst the relentless march of tradition and duty, human lives stitched together in small, imperfect ways. Later, as twilight deepened, the young royals sat side by side on a simple bench, eyes catching the faint shimmer of stars just beginning to appear. The day's chaos had dissolved into peaceful silence, broken only by the gentle rustle of their cloaks and the faint breath of the evening breeze. The nanny, with a long, slow breath, adjusted the princess's shawl, while the tutor quietly reflected on the slow, awkward, but genuine growth they had watched unfold. The prince, leaning against his nurse's shoulder, looked at the horizon with sleepy, dreaming eyes, their lessons mild, mundane, and often unnoticed, were quietly becoming part of something quietly enduring. Somewhere in the shadows, unseen prophets of a sort lingered in their faces, blurred by time, quietly amused by the slow, ordinary life they helped shape day after day. In the quiet hours of the Middle Ages, noble families often gathered their children around, a quiet anticipation lingering in the air as they prepared to shape future rulers. Lady Mirabelle, with her gentle hands, often guided the young princess through simple needlework, her eyes distant yet attentive, aware of the weight each small touch carried. Meanwhile, Master Rowan, with his quiet smile, tutored the princes on matters of state and strategy, their youthful faces slowly weathered by the slow passage of lessons and time. In these moments, it felt almost ordinary, humans comforting humans in their small, forgettable acts that carried the future within them. As seasons shifted outside the stone walls, the learning continued, almost like a ritual as predictable as dawn, yet endlessly significant in its subtlety. But beneath the calm routine, an unspoken tension fluttered, inadequacies masked by patience, the fragile balancing act of care and expectation. Lady Mirabelle often wondered if her soft voice truly planted wisdom, or merely offered gentle distraction from the harsh, distant realities of ruling others. Master Rowan, ever shrewd, watched the children's growing confidence with quiet amusement, knowing full well that these lessons were as much about survival as they were about legacy. The irony softly settled. Those who fostered the crown often knew it was forged in small failures and overlooked mistakes, hidden behind scripted smiles and shared quiet sighs. The future hung suspended in a delicate web of small, imperfect human gestures, each one a tentative step towards something greater, yet constantly shrouded in doubt and irony. One muted afternoon, as the sun slipped lazily through narrow windows, Lady Mirabelle and Master Rowan shared a rare, knowing look, their faces blurred in the gentle glow, shadows caressing tired eyes. They had watched patiently as the children stumbled through lessons, joked quietly in their own childish language, and occasionally, in moments of unguarded honesty, revealed more about their curiosity than all the formal teaching combined. It was at once humorous and tender to see young minds attempting to grasp power, as if it were something to be grasped with small, trembling hands. The irony nestled deep. In shaping young rulers, they had also shaped their own quiet legacies, wisely and shabbily, through the slow, unnoticed art of caring for fragile human spirits. And so, in these moments of stillness, it felt almost inevitable that the future was quietly being formed by everyday acts of patience and restraint. The days settled into a gentle rhythm, with the children now beginning to take small steps towards independence, guided by the ever-present but unseen hand of those who watched and waited. Lady Mirabelle gently tightened her grip around her sewing, her face calm, but lined with the faintest trace of nostalgia. As she reflected on the small milestones and improved etiquette, a confident voice, a moment of serious silence that once seemed impossible. Master Rowan, leaning back in his chair, watched the children's progress with an appraising eye and a knowing smile, amused by the slow unraveling of their potential. There was a certain peacefulness in this routine, ordinary, perhaps, but imbued with the quiet assurance that care, like power, was something built softly, block by block. The burden of expectation, it seemed, was shared in these muted exchanges, and the future, however lightly, was already taking shape. Years later, as the children stepped into their roles, Lady Mirabelle and Master Rowan, now peaceful in their silent pride, reflected on it all with a gentle cynicism that perhaps only experience could inspire. The faces blurred by time, yet their impact endured, woven into the fabric of a throne inherited through patience and small acts of nurturing in quiet rooms. With the kingdom's future secured, they understood that the true legacy was not in grand speeches or shiny medals, but in the soft, unassuming influence of noble nannies and tutors who tended to fragile minds and spirits. In the end, the stories of raising royalty were stories of gentle care mingled with human imperfection stories, perhaps more enduring because of them. And so, beneath the fading light of history's busy clock, the legacy remained quietly woven into the fabric of human effort, slow and imperfect, but fundamentally real. In a quiet mountain monastery somewhere in the distant past, Brother Anselm and Sister Miriam moved through still corridors, their footsteps muffled by aged stone. One day, as the shadows lengthened and the cool air deepened, they noticed a small, trembling group of children huddled near the cloister door, silent, uncertain, abandoned. The faint light in their eyes suggested histories of hardship, yet also a quiet innocence. The community had long upheld an unspoken rule of welcoming strangers, but faced suddenly with these fragile lives, a wave of cautious concern drifted quietly among the monks and nuns. It was a moment of gentle realization that even the smallest acts of mercy might require more than an old vow. They needed hidden spaces, quiet understanding, and a decision to break tradition softly. As days passed, Brother Anselm and Sister Miriam found themselves wrestling with the ancient rule of strict hospitality, a rule that was more a quiet consensus than a written law. The children's presence challenged the community's routines. Their small shadows moved through the monastery's cloisters, making the old stone echo with a faint, unfamiliar hum. Some monks murmured about the risks, the practicalities, others, perhaps, about the sanctity of place and discipline. Underneath the calm veneer of routine, a subtle tension grew, an irony that the very idea of monastery hospitality had been more symbolic than practical, and that perhaps it was now time to redefine its boundaries. Yet, amid the quiet debates, nothing was said aloud. Only the slow turning of hearts and the faint rustling of old commitments. It was during one late afternoon, as the shadows stretched lazily across the cloister, that Brother Anselm and Sister Miriam discovered a cloth-covered corner in the infirmary, a space no one had truly thought to use for children. It was a modest, imperfect hiding place where the fragile voices of the children seemed to linger like a faint whisper of past neglect. The irony of discovering a sanctuary in a forgotten corner was not lost. The community had spoken often of mercy, yet now they faced the necessity of creating a hidden, tender refuge. The community's whispered conversations slowly filled with a kind of amused restraint, acknowledging that their quiet mercy was perhaps more fragile than the stones themselves. And so they approached the idea cautiously, with an unspoken understanding that things might change quietly, imperceptibly, but change they must. Over the following weeks, the monks and nuns organized a small, discreet space within the monastery grounds, a fragile, almost clandestine effort to care for these children. Wooden crates became beds, and scraps of cloth turned into soft blankets. The monastery's daily rhythm adapted clerical prayers, simple meals, quiet tending, each act infused with a gentle purpose. There was a certain stillness in these small chores, as if time had paused, allowing the community to satiate their silent moral questions in quiet acts of kindness. The irony lingered beneath the calm surface. A community that once thought of itself as a sanctuary was now quietly becoming one hidden, imperfect human. These subtle acts of mercy meandered through their daily existence like a slow, unassuming river. In time, the community settled into their gentle new routine, with the orphaned children woven quietly into the fabric of monastery life. Brother Anselm and Sister Miriam watched the small figures grow, their faces blurred by the soft light of dawn, unseen, yet present in every cautious, caring gesture. The monastery's walls, once a symbol of solemn discipline, now echoed softly with the sounds of small laughter and quiet footsteps. They reflected, perhaps, that mercy was never about grand gestures, but about making tiny spaces for those in need, spaces that could quietly endure amid the ordinariness of human life. As the sun dipped behind distant mountains, the community remained still, a touch more human and a touch more gentle than before, quietly aware of the slow, enduring rhythm of genuine care. In the quiet early mornings of the monastic cloisters, the monks and nuns awakened as the faint light filtered through small, barred windows. The rhythmic sounds of wooden floors creaking and soft footsteps marked the start of their daily routine, which quietly included caring for a handful of orphans. These children, sometimes lost in the shuffle of austerity and prayer, were gently integrated into the fold, clad in simple garments, their small hands learning to tidy the stone courtyards or fetch water. It was a tentative beginning, filled with hesitant trust and the soft murmur of prayers that seemed almost like an internal rhythm shared between generations. Amidst the stillness, the ancient walls held the slow, ordinary promise of continuity and quiet compassion. As the day unfolded, the tension subtly crept into the routine. Supplies remained scarce, and moments of doubt flickered among the senior brothers, who wondered whether the small efforts truly mattered. The orphans' mischievous eyes tried to absorb lessons in prayer and work, though their attention often wavered under the weight of hunger or fatigue. The brothers, shadows behind their veils of skepticism, questioned the practicality of these efforts. The children's small hands reached for simple literacy books, with pages made from rough parchment, often torn or smudged. There was a certain irony in the slow, earnest attempts at education, set against the backdrop of shortages and tired faces. Yet the daily persistence persisted, quietly shaping small lives amid the modest routines and muted grumbles. In the quiet hours, an almost humorous stillness grew. The children, sitting cross-legged in the faint glow of afternoon sun, would duct tape their makeshift stories, or trace letters with fingers that trembled from fatigue. The senior brothers often watched from a distance, their faces blurred in the shadowed corners of the large dormitories, as the children's awkward attempts at reading caused a soft, almost bemused smile. The monks realized that despite the skepticism and shortages, there was a gentle, stubborn warmth in these small acts of teaching and caring, like stories told in slow whispers, inevitably imperfect but authentic. Even amid the hurried chores, these quiet moments of learning became subtle acts of resistance against despair. The irony settled into a quiet humor, the effort to teach, to nurture, in a world that seemed to expect little, was itself a small act of hope. As evening approached, the monastic community settled into calmer rhythms. Meals were simple, often just bread and watery broth, shared in communal silence, broken only by the soft shuffling of feet and the distant hum of evening prayers. The orphans, now tired and quietly engrossed in their tasks, or softly dozing in their mats, found some comfort in the predictable cadence of the day's end. The senior brothers, though still wary, began to see these children as part of the slow, ongoing tapestry of monastic life. Each small success, each gentle correction, a stitch in the larger fabric of quiet service. The light in the cloistered corridors grew softer, less impatient, as the community drifted into a peaceful, contemplative calm. The slow, deliberate nature of their care seemed to echo through the stone walls, a testament to endurance woven into daily life. In the stillness of night, with the faint glow of lanterns flickering against the stone, the monks and nuns quietly reflected on their days, knowing well that progress was measured in small, nearly invisible steps. The blurred faces of prophets or sacred figures, hidden behind layers of tradition, seemed to watch over the simple routines of caring, a gentle reminder of humility and patience. Perhaps, in their quiet way, these monastic caregivers understood that the true act of nurturing wasn't found in grand gestures, but in the unremarkable, consistent moments, offering shelter and hope in a world often too weary to notice. With the faintest smile, they listened to the faint whispers of children settling into sleep, the distant hum of prayer mingling with the soft, steady heartbeat of shared human quietude beneath the ancient, watchful walls. In the quiet stillness of a late summer morning, the monks and nuns moved slowly about the stone cloister, their routines unhurried as they prepared the day's small meals and tendrils of prayer. The monastery's modest storehouses, usually brimming with wheat and dried herbs, now showed the faint signs of depletion, as a stubborn drought had slowly sapped the land's generosity. The children, bundled in worn cloth and clutching small wooden toys, watched with wide, unworried eyes, unaware of the shifting tensions among their caretakers. It was a moment of calm before necessity pressed itself into the daily rhythm, urging the community to confront a quiet crisis. The air was thick with the soft hum of bees and the distant call of a lone bird, as if nature itself was indifferent to human worries. As days passed, the harshness of the drought became undeniable, and the silence inside the storerooms grew heavier. The caregivers, usually gentle and composed, began to exchange careful glances, their expressions tinged with both resolve and a faint worry. Food grew scarce, and the mountain of loaves of bread dwindled. The children's cheeks were a little less round, their hands fidgeted more often. With a measured calmness, the community decided that something must be done, a daring pilgrimage to seek alms from nearby towns. The monks and nuns packed small satchels with a piece of bread and a water flask, their faces obscured by the shadow of their hoods, as they prepared to leave behind the quiet safety of the monastery. It was a test of faith, but also of patience as they faced the uncertain journey ahead. The journey was not dramatic, just slow tramping through fields cracked and gray, under a sky hanging heavy and featureless. The monks and nuns moved in modest procession, their steps steady and deliberate. Ironically, the more they sought generosity from strangers, the more they encountered the mundane indifference of rural life, planted crops withering in the sun, villagers absorbed in their own small struggles. Their efforts seemed both earnest and faintly comic, like a quiet comedy written by necessity rather than humor. Yet they pressed on, the blurred faces of prophets and saints imagined in the shifting shadows cast by their worn hats and cloaks, perhaps unseen witnesses to their modest pilgrimage. The air was warm, and their footsteps crunched softly on gravel, as if the earth itself was weary. Eventually, the search bore fruit in the form of humble donations, some bread, a few vegetables, collected with gentle gratitude. Returning to the monastery, the community felt a slowly settling calm as their stores were replenished, if only slightly. The children's faces brightened momentarily at the small feast, their innocence untouched by the hardship. The caregivers' relieved smiles carried a quiet irony, an acknowledgement that survival depended on quiet acts of bravery and humility, often hidden behind unremarkable faces. Inside the cool stone walls, they resumed their routines, not with sudden joy, but with a soft, measured acceptance, like the gentle ebb of tide. The drought persisted outside, but within, a fragile peace settled once again, balanced on the shared effort of simple human kindness. In the stillness that followed, the monastery's walls seemed to hold the weight of small sacrifices without complaint, as if aging alongside their quiet stories. The children played softly, their voices a faint ripple in the calm, while the monks and nuns continued their daily prayers and chores, their faces now lingering moments in shifting light, blurred, unseen, but quietly present, reflecting on the ordeal. It was clear that resilience was built, not through grand gestures or divine intervention, but through a steady, unspoken affirmation of community's modest endurance. The skies remained overcast, with the faint suggestion of future storms or droughts. Yet the human effort to carry on persisted in its own silent, slow way. Somewhere deep within the stone walls, a faint, humbling humor persisted. Life's absurdity was in how little it sometimes takes to keep going. An occasional basket of bread, a moment of shared quiet, a hope held softly in the shadows of everyday life. In the quiet hours of a late afternoon, the monastic walls stood firm against the settling light, and a gentle sense of purpose filled the air. The children in the orphan wing had just finished their modest supper, their their small hands clutching cups and bread, while the monks and nuns moved with the slow rhythm of calm routine. It was a place where ordinary days often stretched into one another, each small act stitched into the tapestry of Benedictine life, quiet, deliberate, and slightly monotonous. The faces of the sacred figures at the altar remained obscured by a faint glow, unseen but present in the background. Here, amid the faint scent of wax and laundry, life drifted peacefully, unaware of the coming test of their quiet vows. The stillness was abruptly broken when a faint flicker broke the air's gentle stillness, a glow on the far wall, followed quickly by a thin line of smoke curling upward. It was the fire in the orphan wing, ignited perhaps by an unattended candle or an ember that escaped its grasp. The sudden heat prickled at their skin, and the faint crackle of flames grew louder in the enclosing quiet. Brother Anselm's eyes widened slightly, and Sister Miriam reached instinctively for the children's small hands, her expression cautious but calm, as the familiar weight of responsibility settled into each movement. Their routine had suddenly turned into a matter of urgent necessity, with familiar faces now silhouetted against the burning shadows. Amid the chaos, there was a strange note of irony. How often their days had been filled with small, mundane tasks that seemed so unremarkable. Now, in the face of real danger, they remembered that ordinary tools, a bucket, an old cloth, could forge a fragile hope. As flames licked the ceiling, and the children's frightened whispers filled the air, the monks and nuns moved with slow, practiced coordination, almost as if they had rehearsed this moment in their minds many times. Each person's face was blurred by the flickering firelight, a mask of resolve and underlying worry. It was a reminder that routine, no matter how dull, was sometimes the only armor against the unpredictable silence of disaster. Slowly, the fire was subdued, and the smoke began to clear, revealing the tired but unbroken faces of those who had acted. The children's cheeks were streaked with soot, yet they clung to their caretakers like small, innocent anchors. The monks and nuns took a moment to settle among the ruins, their breaths shallow, but their eyes calm, as if acknowledging the delicate boundary between chaos and order. The day's sudden test had revealed some quiet truths, that resilience often lay in small acts, and faith was less about divine intervention and more about steady presence. The shadows on the wall softened, and the air grew cooler, marking the end of a long, slow chapter of shared human effort. Later, as dusk settled over the monastery, the scene was painted in a gentle, reflective light, that quiet tone of life that hums beneath moments of crisis. The children, now safe, drifted into small, subdued naps, their faces peaceful once again. The monks and nuns returned to their routines, perhaps a little more mindful of the fragile line between stability and chaos, their faces still blurred by the dimming light. In these quiet hours, the story of the fire became like so many small lessons in patience and humility, a reminder that even in imperfect lives, acts of caring hold quiet power. And so, with the faintest smile of weary reassurance, the monastery settled into its slow, timeless rhythm, just as it had for generations, calm, imperfect, and somehow still hopeful. Long ago, in quiet stone-walled monasteries, monks and nuns began gently tending to a small, overlooked need: children left orphaned by life's relentless quiet toll. With time, they built simple spaces where the soft sounds of crib springs and quiet murmurs became a common lullaby amid the faint scent of herbs and dusty pages. It was not a grand gesture, but a slow, steady practice, one that emerged from small moments of kindness amidst the daily grind. These early efforts, often unnoticed outside their cloisters, planted seeds of a quiet tradition that aimed to care without fanfare. The children, small and wide-eyed, learned in these humble walls that even ordinary kindness could become a lasting legacy. Yet, with this new purpose, there came the complication of structure. As the monastery's wing was reconstructed, the old routines faced the rigid discipline of documentation, records of feedings, lessons, and tiny milestones that needed chronicling to ensure consistent care. Some wondered if such order might diminish the gentle chaos that once characterized their informal practices. But the monks and nuns persisted, wary of losing the fragile thread they tended so carefully. Ironically, in trying to formalize compassion, they sometimes seemed to tame its unpredictable, spontaneous nature. Compassion, now as much a system as a smile. Despite this, the atmosphere remained softly pragmatic, with quiet glances exchanged over parchment and ink, acknowledging the importance of keeping these lives steady on their uncertain paths. Over time, these careful records and routines began to ripple outward, quietly influencing other houses and communities. Perhaps it was the simple act of acknowledging each child's name in a ledger, or the slow, deliberate act of fitting tiny shoes onto trembling feet that started to spread as a model of gentle, structured care. The irony lay in how, in trying to safeguard their methods, the caregivers sometimes forgot the spontaneous warmth that first inspired them. Still, the shared commitment persisted, carried forward by those children who, having grown, took their place among the lay brothers and nuns, becoming caretakers themselves. Sometimes, with a wry smile at the slow, steady progress made. The little routines, mundane as they seemed, became a subtle inheritance, a kind of quiet resilience woven into their daily existence. As years settled into decades, the original purpose settled into their bones, an unspoken, enduring truth of shared responsibility. The once fragile hope to nurture future generations endured through these now seasoned caregivers, who moved gently from small acts to lifelong commitments. Episodes of fatigue and humor mingled, an impatient hand fumbling with a cloth, a sleepy child tugging at a nun's sleeve, reminding everyone that care was neither perfect nor grand, but simply constant. In these small moments, the monastery's work felt less like obligation and more like an unremarkable part of the quiet rhythm of life, an everyday act that, in its humility, became a quiet testament to resilience. The faces, often blurred by the dim light of the cloisters, held stories of patience, kindness, and an awkward kind of hopefulness that persisted quietly through the seasons. Today, what remains is a soft echo of those early efforts, a testament to care matched with an imperfect human touch. The children who once fussed and cried, now adults, often return to remember their beginnings in the muted halls of the old monastery, where kindness was their steady companion. Somewhere within these walls, the faces of prophets and saints are obscured, shadowed by light, as if to say that true compassion never was about perfection, but about persistent, everyday acts of love. The legacy, fragile yet resilient, lies not in grand gestures, but in the slow accumulation of small human moments, ordinary acts stitched into the tapestry of generations. And so, in the quiet corners of history, the gentle story of care endures, a reminder that warmth often takes the form of quiet persistence amid the mundane. In the soft, amber glow of a late medieval afternoon, young Aline sat cross-legged on a rough wooden bench, her small hands tracing the pattern of her mother's weaving. The market buzzed quietly nearby, a distant clatter of carts and murmured voices blending into a gentle hum, while her mother discussed the day's figures with a neighbor, her voice low and measured. As the weaving machine clicked rhythmically, her mother winced slightly at the thought of balancing their modest income against the needs of a newborn. A small bag of coins lay open in front of her, the faint jingle reminding her that every penny counted in the quiet economy of their household. That moment felt both ordinary and crucial, part of a slow tide of daily decisions in a life that valued survival alongside a faint hope for comfort. Days later, Aline watched her mother negotiate with a local wet nurse under the shade of a low-ceilinged room, where shadows played softly on the earthen walls. Her mother's voice was calm but purposeful, exchanging small coins for the nurse's care as her hands fidgeted nervously with a worn cloth. The conversation was pragmatic, discussing feedings, the scent of herbs, and the warmth of the small cot, yet laced with a quiet tension that only those familiar with the delicate economy of family life could feel. Alin's eyes darted from her mother's steady face to the tired eyes of the woman accepting the payment, both quietly agreeing on the modest exchange that kept their household functioning. Somewhere in this exchange, the simple act of caring became an act of balancing, subtly woven into the fabric of everyday hardship. An ironic calm settled when the household adapted to this new rhythm. Alin's mother returning her focus to her loom, and hushed conversations about debts and bartering. Behind her, the small cradle remained unoccupied for now, as everyone understood that even the most basic childcare was a calculated expense, as much a matter of practicality as of affection. Alin often watched her mother with a half smile, noticing how she carefully measured every coin, every hour spent in labor and care, aware that the economics of their lives depended on silent bargains and unspoken compromises. The quiet hum of daily chores persisted meanwhile, clothes washed in cold water, bread baked slowly in a shared warmth, an unpretentious testament to their enduring modesty. Here, the mundane routines carried a subtle humor, as human effort and necessity intertwined in a slow dance of reason and necessity. As seasons passed, the rhythm of household labor grew into a gentle, predictable calm, people moving softly through their spaces, shadows shifting as the sun rose and fell. Alin's mother often sat in the corner near the fire, her hands resting on her lap, while her eyes grew distant behind a veil of soft light. The weight of their small economy seemed to lift into a quiet acceptance, where money, labor, and love intertwined like woven thread, slowly, quietly, without fanfare or urgency. The emotional landscape was one of patience, woven from simple acts of care, quiet negotiations, and routine patience that persisted despite the existential modesty of their needs. In a way, they had learned to cherish this stillness, knowing that each small decision, like feeding a child or setting aside a few coins, was part of a bigger, unspoken story of endurance. Looking back, the story of young Alin's family was one of understated resilience. Each gesture, each exchange, a testament to how households navigated life's quiet economics long before the grandeur of cities or the gloss of modern currency. Their days flowed into one another, punctuated by the subtle poetry of everyday survival, shaped not by grand plans, but by small, deliberate choices that kept everyone fed and cared for. The blurred faces of prophets and saints from the distant past seemed to hover unseen in the background, shadows cast by the flickering hearth, never quite grasped, but always felt. Their lives, woven quietly into the tapestry of history, remind us that even in simplicity, there is a profound grace, a slow hum of human hope and adaptation, patient and enduring, like the gentle loom of time itself. In the quiet hum of early mornings, Alin's father prepared himself for the day's work, slipping a few coins into a worn leather pouch. The village guild's apprenticeship program was a slow, predictable dance, marked by the soft clink of metal and the measured steps of children and trainees alike. Among the many rules was a simple but constant tally. A childcare levy, paid in small coins, meant to support the communal creche that cared for the youngest villagers. These payments, modest and routine, funded both the instruction and the invisible network of women and men who kept watch over the little ones while their parents labored nearby. It was an unspoken understanding that childhood was shared among many hands, and coins were the quiet currency binding this fragile social fabric. As the sun cast long shadows, the village's familiar routines persisted, quietly shaping generations. As Alin's father settled into the embroidery of his day, a subtle tension stirred beneath the routine, an awareness that these payments, necessary as they were, sometimes fell short of the effort required. The communal creche, busy and noisy, with tiny feet and soft voices, relied on the steady flow of purse strings that rarely swelled, often just enough to keep the cradles rocking and the shutters open. Occasionally, disagreements flickered like faint fireflies, whether the fees were fair, or if the burdens weighted too heavily on those with fewer coins, an irony not lost on anyone. The children, oblivious to these exchanges, slept or played amid the muffled sounds of adult concerns, their innocence contrasting softly with the quiet negotiations that kept their world running. It was a slow reminder that even in shared effort, disparity sometimes lingered in the background, unspoken yet palpable. A strange humor threaded through the village's routine. How these small coins, gathered day after day, became both a practical necessity and a quiet symbol of communal faith. The fees, standardized yet imperfect, funded the day-to-day logistics of childcare and training, yet somehow also seemed a modest jest of human ingenuity. The overseers, faces blurred in the shadows of the late afternoon, enforced the levies with the same casual indifference that marked all old, enduring systems. Sometimes, a young apprentice would try to barter for extra time or a lighter fee, only to be met with gentle, unyielding silence. The entire operation chugged along, a slow-moving testament to the absurdity of trying to put a price on the simple act of caring for children, an act that, in its essence, defied the calculations of coins and contracts. And yet, it was that very system that held the fragile thread of village life together. By the time evening pressed softly against the thatched roofs, a calm settled over the village. The children, now sound asleep in the communal creches, rested beneath patchwork blankets, their breaths gentle and unburdened by the day's quiet complexities. The guardians, quietly amused or simply resigned, counted the last of the day's coins, their faces catching faint glints in the flickering lantern light. The levies collected, imperfect yet sufficient, contributed not only to training, but also unwittingly sustained a network of silent mutual support, a kind of informal social contract woven from small, deliberate payments and shared sweat. As I walk through these scenes, I feel the slow pulse of a society that understood, in its mundane way, that human labor and care could be kept afloat with modest exchanges, never perfect, yet fundamentally enough to keep hope and order afloat. It's in this stillness that history whispers softly, reminding us of the quiet work of community and care. Looking back, one might think of these medieval village arrangements as distant, yet somehow familiar, an unending dance of necessity, humor, and the faint poetry of everyday human effort. The coins, the apprenticeships, the household chores, they all formed the subtle backdrop to countless lives quietly intertwined. In the end, the levies were less about the money itself than about the shared acknowledgement that childhood, with all its messy innocence, was a communal treasure worth slowly, patiently being paid for day by day. Perhaps in these modest exchanges lay a quiet lesson on how communities endure through routine, resilience, and the gentle acceptance of human imperfection. And as the village settles into its night, the slow, still rhythm of humanity continues, unhurried, unbroken, gently humming in the background. In the dim light of early mornings, a mother carefully handed over a small, worn cloth doll to her daughter Aline, both aware that this modest gift was also a form of payment for the lessons in household chores. The yard around them was quiet, save for the distant clatter of cookware and the faint rustle of straw mats. Aline's young face, marked by a mixture of curiosity and an acceptance of the daily routine, reflected the quiet rhythm of such exchanges, simple yet embedded with unspoken hopes. The economy of their lives wasn't built on coins, but on shared labor, a barter of time and tenderness that felt as natural as the dawn's first light. In those moments, childhood was less a stage of innocence and more a quiet transaction of growing up amid the hum of household chores. As weeks passed, the burden of dual expectations settled more clearly into Alin's shoulders. She was meant to learn her craft, perhaps spinning or tending the small garden, while also assisting her mother with chores that seemed endless. There was an ironic rhythm in this, where the boundaries of apprentice and helper blurred into one, each task a lesson in patience and endurance. Occasionally, an older neighbor might nod approvingly, exchanging a few carefully measured coins for her help, but mostly it was informal, just a nod and a smile, as if labor was an unspoken gift exchanged among neighbors and family alike. Alin sensed an unspoken hierarchy. Mastery was a future goal, but now her days were filled with small physical demands that chipped away at her youthful ease. The tension between ambition and obligation quietly simmered in these shared hours. In the lull of the afternoon, a mother might lean on a wooden bench, her face blurred in the shadowed light, while her children tended to a fire that flickered stubbornly. The household's quiet economy depended on this informal apprenticeship, where skills were handed down not solely through instruction, but through mimicry and quiet patience. Sometimes the barter was obvious: extra bread for a few hours of watching younger siblings or peeling herbs. But often it was invisible, woven into the fabric of daily life. The irony lingered in the way labor offered a way to lighten household burdens, yet also intertwined personal growth with mundane chores. Alin, peering into the faint warmth of the hearth, wondered if her hopes of a different future could ever break free from this slow, steady grind. By evening, the household seemed to settle into a slow, gentle calm, the day's noise dissolving into the softer sounds of sighs and the crackling of a small fireplace. Alin sat nearby, her hands idle, but her mind quietly reflecting on her journey, how her learning was quietly intertwined with her helping, each reinforcing the other in this unending cycle. The faces of prophets or teachers, if glimpsed at all, were always blurred behind the soft glow of the setting sun, their randomness reassuring in their anonymity. The ironies of her small world persisted, where every small effort felt both insignificant and essential, a live reminder of how human economies, even in their simplest forms, wove together necessity and care. Here, in the calming quiet, she felt the faintest trace of understanding that growth often came subtle in the silent exchange of daily life. In the end, Alin's quiet apprenticeship was a mirror of her entire world, fraught with small contradictions, woven through routines that felt both burdensome and tender. Her story, like so many others, carried a subtle humor in its persistence, a gentle nod to the absurdities of human effort. As darkness settled outside, she understood that this slow, inexorable passage of payments in chores, of lessons in patience, was both the weight and the gift of growing up in such a household. Perhaps in these understated exchanges, there was a quiet dignity, a reminder that even in fatigue, life persisted with a certain calm grace, stitched together by tiny acts of labor and love. In the quiet hours of early spring, Alin's household went about their routine as they had done for years, feeding the baby, milking the goats, and exchanging soft words over warm hearths. The markets nearby stored little excitement, just the steady hum of daily life, and the gentle rustling of cloth as women tended to their chores. For a while, the economy of childcare was as predictable as the dawn, built on small payments, shared labor, and silent understanding. Yet beneath this calm, a slow undercurrent of worry lingered, unspoken, but palpable in the moments when bread grew scarce. Children's laughter mingled with the soft cadence of domestic tasks, unaware of the delicate balance that kept their world turning. It was, in its way, a peaceful sort of stability, a fragile peace held together by routine and quiet dependency. Then came the news. A famine had taken hold further out, whispers swelling into the reality of empty granaries and rising prices. Food, once abundant, now hung heavy on the markets, its cost forcing families to stretch coins thinner and thinner. Alin's household, like many others, faced the slow realization that payments to the wet nurse and all the small creditors might not be kept up. The girls' usual lullabies faded into quiet, tense discussions by the hearth as debts accumulated silently against the backdrop of hunger. The guilds, rigid and cautious, responded by tightening credit, unlocking none of the kindness from before. In that waning moment of stability, the gentle rhythm of life slowed further, shadows lengthening over the delicate fabric of childhood care, now fraying at the edges. Eventually, as the worst of the crisis began to ebb, a slow calm returned, though it carried the weight of what had been lost. Alin's family, battered but still standing, adjusted their routines, dividing chores more evenly, foregoing some comforts, and patiently waiting for markets to stabilize. The household's collective breathing found a steadier rhythm, less hurried, more reflective. The wet nurse, her face still obscured, but her presence subtly more subdued, resumed her care with a practiced patience born of hardship. The guilds loosened their grip gradually, allowing some trust to rebuild. Yet the shadows of debt and scarcity lingered like a faint fog, reminders of a fragile balance on the edge of fragile stability. In this quiet restoration, the small details, the touch of a baby's hand, A shared glance held slow stories of resilience and quiet endurance. Looking back through the years, it is clear that these moments of disruption revealed how tied the threads of childhood care truly were to the broader fabric of household and economic life. The entire web: payments, apprenticeships, household labor reminded those who watched that stability was often a thin veneer over deeper currents of human effort and uncertainty. The blurred faces of prophets, seen briefly in visions of better times, now seemed like distant shadows, unseen by many, perhaps trusting in an unseen order, or simply tired from the ongoing effort of daily life. What remained quietly was a recognition. Human care, much like the economy itself, was a slow, imperfect process, held together not by grand gestures, but by small, persistent acts of patience and resilience. And so, in the gentle afterglow of hardship, life moved forward, rumbling forward in its slow, silent way. In the quiet hours of a fading afternoon, families like Alin's began to notice the subtle shifts in routine: children's laughter mingling with the soft clatter of wooden toys, while the village's craftsmen considered the quiet promise of shared labor. It was a time when the burdens of household labor weighed heavily. Yet there was a faint flicker of hope that harmony could be restored through simpler means: payments, small offers of help, and quiet cooperation. The air was filled with the faint scent of stale bread and faded cloth, a reminder of the ongoing effort to keep life steady amid uncertainty. As families watched their children play, a collective patience unfolded like a slow tide, hinting at a coming change. The weary faces of mothers and fathers carried the gentle weight of longing for balance, uncertain if such a thing was possible in a world so easily disturbed by routine crises. Tensions grew as the social fabric strained. Some families hesitated to trust the uneven generosity of neighbors, while others negotiated quietly over who would take on the small, necessary chores. The local guild, weary but pragmatic, proposed a more structured approach: formal apprenticeships for mothers, and a rudimentary childcare fund, an attempt to impose order on the chaos of household care. The conversations carried a muted intensity, like the faint scratching of quills on parchment, as uncertainty mingled with cautious optimism. Yet beneath the surface, there was a shared awareness that without these measures, stability might slip further beyond reach. The children's innocent voices persisted, unaware of the shifting agreements shaping their future care, echoing softly like a distant melody in the slow, still air. Ironically, as formal agreements began to emerge, the very utopian hopes of unwavering stability seemed to falter. Some payments arrived late, others were meager, and the apprenticeships often turned into communal chores rather than individual support. The guild's shared childcare fund became a quiet symbol of effort, yet it also revealed the fragile human humor in these arrangements, where promises were made with a shrug and a faint smile. Mothers who entered apprenticeships sometimes found themselves sapped of energy, their days stretched thinner than ever, yet they persisted with weary patience. The household sounds persisted, clinking pots, children's giggles, and the faint murmur of adult negotiations, each a testament to the slow, imperfect dance of cooperation. An almost subtle irony lay in how these efforts, made with the best intentions, often underscored the quiet resilience of everyday human folly. Over time, a gentle calm settled like a soft blanket over the community, as household economies found a new, if imperfect, equilibrium. Payments became more regular, articulated with less tension, while apprenticeships found a rhythm that, although imperfect, provided a measure of relief. The household chores, once a source of quiet despair, now intertwined with these formal structures, each small act of cooperation, weaving a fabric of shared responsibility. Faces relaxed into expressions of patience and mild humor, recognizing their collective, imperfect effort. The children's daily routines moved forward, seemingly unaware of the slow political negotiations behind their care. In this quiet steadiness, the community glimpsed a fragile, faintly humorous truth that harmony, much like life itself, is a slow, ongoing process, neither perfect nor perfectible in its human simplicity. Looking back, the story of Alin's family and their neighbors became a quiet testament to the slow evolution of communal life. How payments, apprenticeships, and household labor, despite their flaws and occasional absurdities, slowly became woven into a more stable pattern. It was a story of humble efforts, subtle negotiations, and the accidental humor that accompanies human attempts at order. The faces of the villagers, blurred by the soft glow of evening, seemed to smile at their shared imperfection, knowing that what mattered was the effort itself. A fragile balance reached through patience. As the village settled into this rhythm, it became clear that true stability was less about perfect structures than about the gentle persistence of daily life. And so, with quiet humor and a collective sigh, they all moved forward, perhaps not perfectly, but together, in the slow, peaceful dance of human endurance.